It's New Year's Day, January 1st, 2024, and you can't wait. It's the first time in years that you can't wait to get back to work. Why? Because you've discovered the new X app. The X app does it all for you. It will automatically track your invoices and your payables, take care of everything, make sure everything's paid on time, make sure everything's collected time. It truly is the do everything app that will take care of everything in your accounting process for you, short of the general ledger entries themselves. The X app even has AI that will predict when it's time to invoice somebody and use predictive language to figure out exactly what to invoice them for, looking at history and all kinds of other data, so that it minimizes the amount that you have to interact with and prepare invoices that go out to clients. Once the invoices are sent out, it will track the aging, it will send out collection notices, and when and if necessary, send the client to collections. This is what you've always wanted, the one app that handles everything. In fact, when you get to work every morning and get to your desk, the X app will give you a list of everything you need to do, exactly how much time it's expected to take. It even includes factoring in breaks and unexpected interruptions of things that came up that you have to stop and take care of right away. It truly takes care of everything you need to handle your day with perfection. It's all there, all accounted for. You just have to show up and get into a flow state with everything that you need to do from one day to the next, from 1 hour to the next, from 1 minute to the next even. And of course, there's almost no learning curve, and it's super inexpensive. The X app is the Excalibur of all apps, and you, sir or ma'am, are like Sir Galahad in your quest to find the X app stuck in whatever rock it was left in by the Lady of the Lake. But unless your name is Arthur and you have a magical friend named Merlin, I'm going to guess that you haven't found the X app yet, nor do you expect to in the very near future. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm obsessed with productivity apps. At the center of my focus is always QuickBooks Online. In other words, what I'm really obsessed with is looking at ways to manage all the accounting adjacent stuff, all the work management processes that we have and that we need really to ensure that all the things we have to do in QuickBooks and for the whole accounting cycle can get done with the greatest efficiency, accuracy, and of course, the greatest effectiveness. In other words, I can do something with great efficiency, but if I'm sacrificing quality along the way, then it's ineffective, right? So it's really important that I maximize efficiency and accuracy and effectiveness all at the same time. Over the past couple of years, I've been doing extensive research into this because I've just been sort of, like I said, obsessed and fascinated with the idea of what it is that makes people more or less productive, particularly in the accounting industry. Why are so many of us up to our eyeballs and stressed out? Is it simply because we have more work to do than we could possibly manage? Or is there a solution? Might there be a solution, a way to cut down, a way to enable us to work effectively, efficiently, and with great accuracy, while at the same time reducing all of the stress that so many of us seem to experience? And I'm developing a system which I plan to release at the end of this year called my Bulletproof Notion project. And it's based on things that I've learned from many, many different sources, including several books and tons of articles that I clipped, plus, of course, my own direct experience working in the field for over 20 years. The reality is your perfect day might look a bit like what I described above, where you get to your desk in the morning and you have the exact list of everything you need to do with it really well planned out. See, most of us overschedule and we're sort of overly optimistic about what we're going to get done, and that causes stress. And what I'm going to begin encouraging people to do more and more is underschedule and then be sort of more realistic in terms of setting expectations about deadlines that we commit to. Now, this includes, as I mentioned in my original description, planning for the unexpected disruptions. We have to assume, as we're planning out our schedule, that things are going to come up that were unexpected, that we can't defer, right? And so we have to leave room in our schedule to be able to account for that stuff to the best of our ability. Then if on any given day it turns out nothing like that comes up, great. If anything, you'll have extra time. And in this system, we have several categories, but not too many to be confusing, but several categories of things that we need to do. There are the scheduled items, which must be completed on the day that they're scheduled. And then we have next action items, which is a pile of all the things that we haven't scheduled yet, but they're important and they need to get done somewhere in the near future, so that on those days when the unexpected things don't come up, we can go into our list of next action items and pull things off of there and start knocking those things off. What I'm describing here in the bigger picture is a system where you can capture, clarify, and organize everything you need to do and put it in its appropriate place or category in terms of priority. Now, many of you have systems, but you don't actually trust them, even if you think you do. And here's the proof. Think about it like this. How often throughout the day is your brain reminding you of something that still hasn't gotten done yet, and it might be in your system, but the reality is if you can trust that system, your brain will stop serving up those reminders. This isn't my opinion. This is science. This is very well documented in David Allen's book, Getting Things Done, which is one of the major sources that I'm leaning on in development of my Bulletproof Notion project. So if your brain is still serving you up reminders of things that are in that system, then you haven't developed that system in a way where you can truly trust it, where your brain, independent of you, trusts it. Now, the reason your brain can trust that system is a critical part of the process, which is that you review it regularly, daily and weekly, and then even at other intervals. There's different aspects of what you'll review on a daily versus a weekly basis. For example, those next action items, you'll probably want to look into daily, and certainly each week, you'll review it at a certain point to see if it's time to make sure that one of those or more of those items gets scheduled, meaning now you've selected a date where it absolutely must get done. Now, if you've ever read David Allen's Getting Things Done, if you've truly studied it, if you claim to be implementing it in your workflow, then you should recognize those terms, and you should recognize the fact that I left a couple off at the end. So now I want to give you the complete list, which is as follows. You capture, clarify, organize, reflect, and engage, right? Reflect is that review process where you're looking in on things, regularly, often. That's how your brain comes to know it. It can trust your system. As soon as your brain thinks that it can't trust your system, it will start serving up those reminders again, right? And serving up those reminders is what's causing you a lot of stress. You can be in the middle of doing something, all of a sudden you remember some other thing that you need to get done that you can't possibly work on right now. In other words, our brains are great at serving up these reminders, but they're not very accurate in terms of serving them up at a time when we can actually do something about them, right? As David Allen describes, when do you usually remember that you need to put batteries in the flashlight? Usually it's when you need the flashlight and you go to turn it on and it's not working, right? It would be much more accurate if your brain reminded you to get batteries when you're in line at the supermarket and the batteries are right in front of you. So that list, and I'll repeat it again for you, it's capture, clarify, organize, reflect, and engage. The engage part is where we actually get into it and start doing the work. That is the list that describes the perfect system for getting things done. It's the backbone of everything David Allen teaches in his book. And if you haven't read it or haven't read it in a long time, I highly recommend you pick up. He rewrote a newer version of it a few years back to take into account the fact that we have all kinds of technology, what I'm calling work management tools. Most of you are used to calling them project management tools. I'll explain the distinction later on. But bottom line is his system is one that can be used with pen and paper or any work management, project management tool that you may be using, because his system is really around the concepts, and then you just have to decide how to apply those concepts. Now, if you're going to get a book like this or review a book like this, the key is don't just read it. You have to study it. The way I'm going through this book and a couple of others, another one I'm about to mention in a minute, is by reading the chapters and taking notes. And I use Notion for taking notes. I don't care what you use, as long as it's a system you can trust, a system you're going to go back to review those notes. For example, the book I'm about to mention, I'll mention it now. It's called Come Up for Air by Nick Sonnenberg. This book also has had a major influence on my Bulletproof Notion project. It has informed much of the structure and the concepts that I'm going to talk about with you for the rest of this video, as well as what I'm doing in Bulletproof Notion. I'll be honest, I love his concepts and I love his process and his framework. I don't love his choice of apps, and that's okay, because that's the point again, is that I can take the apps that I love and plug them in and use his concept, use his process, okay? But his process, his framework, is what makes it easy to organize all of this, because by now you're wondering, and maybe the reason you started watching this video in the first place is because you were wondering, as the title suggests, about your tech stack, and is it time to update it? In other words, are you using the right apps? Do you need to find new apps? Are you using any apps at all? Should you be, right? All those kind of questions, and I promise you I'm going to answer them as the rest of this video unfolds, but I want to lay the right foundation for you so that you understand the context around whether or not and when and why you should find and choose a new app. So now let's talk about Nick Sonnenberg's Come Up for Air. And all these books I'm mentioning, obviously they're easy to search for, but I'm going to make sure all the links are available. If you're watching this on YouTube, just check the description and click over to the write-up on my website, and there you'll find everything linked up beautifully, so it's very easy to find all these resources that I'm mentioning today. So Nick Sonnenberg's Come Up for Air, the book title itself paints a kind of an image, right? And I think many of us can relate to it, as in we're suffocating or we're drowning in all of this work, and we're struggling to keep it manageable somehow. And then that brings in what for many of us adds stress, as in which apps do I need to use to manage all of this? And am I using the right ones, or should I be changing them, and so on? Is it time for an update, right? So that's why we're talking about your accounting tech status update. This is your update. This is how to go about doing your update and reviewing your whole system to see, does it need an overhaul? Does it need just maybe a few tweaks? I don't know. You have to decide that for yourself. I'm just going to give you the framework that I've learned from these different sources for how to help make that decision. So his framework, perfectly structured, is called the CPR Framework, right? You come up for air, you're drowning, you need CPR, right? But CPR in this case stands for communications, planning, and resources. Okay, those are the three categories under which all of your apps will fall, right? So what does that mean? Let's break it down. And by the way, in theory, all you need are 5 apps across all 3 of these categories, right? We're going to talk about 2 communications apps. We're going to talk about 1 planning app, which is where your work management is. And we're going to talk about your resources, where we're going to talk about 2 different apps you need. And actually, because of where my, just call it experience or opinion or whatever you want to call it, differs from Nick's, is that I believe I've got it to where we can consolidate this to even fewer than 5. But it's because I have the same app that's serving several of these functions, whereas he suggests a different app for each of these functions. That's the main distinction. So under communications, we're in theory going to have 2 apps under communications, and bottom line is you have internal communications and external. Those are the 2 categories where you need 2 different apps. Now internally, we're going to Nick suggests using something like Slack or Microsoft Teams. If you're a Microsoft heavy house, right, then you're probably going to want to use Teams. But the bottom line is one of those kinds of tools, and really what I want to stress is not email. Email is a terrible way of communicating, especially internally. It's a mess, right? Now, externally, he suggests using email. That's what you're going to use with your clients, for example. I personally feel, and for years I proved it, I've been able to get clients buy-in. When I bought the book and I emailed with somebody from his team about it, they suggested that many clients won't want to, quote unquote, buy into another tool to communicate with you. But my experience was the opposite. My experience was that most of my clients bought in, and with very few exceptions, they all eventually thanked me for kind of forcing them into Slack, because they ultimately agreed it was a much better way to communicate and organize what we were doing together. So that part's totally up to you. But in theory, you need to define 2 communications apps, 1 for external, 1 for internal. That needs to be documented in your company wiki, which is something we'll talk about in a few more minutes. Okay, so communications, 2 apps, 1 for internal, 1 for external. Define it, decide what you're going to use, make sure that anybody you bring into your organization understands this, that this is your policy, that they're not to be using some other tool to communicate with people. Clients will drag you into any number of different means of communications. God knows how many clients I've had over the years who started texting me like photographs of documents that they wanted to send me, and I just had to lay down the law and say, you should assume that I am not going to act on this. Assume I'm going to forget about it. Anything you send me via text or WhatsApp or some other such tool that I don't want to use for client work, you should assume I'm going to drop that ball. That's kind of how I've worded it very directly to clients, and it gets the message across, right? So you decide. 2 communications apps, 1 for internal, 1 for external. You decide. Bottom line, you're going to need email to some extent. There's going to be, you can't just completely forget about and ignore email. Even if you're like me now, where I don't really handle my email. If you send me an email, you get an autoresponder. But basically what I'm doing is I'm deferring all that to Mary, who's my assistant, and she handles the email for me. So it's not accurate to say that I just don't do email. I created a system to get myself mostly out of email. And I assure you, there are still emails I get that I still respond to. So, communications. Now let's talk about planning. This is your work management area. And as I mentioned earlier, most of you call this project management. But the reason that Nick explains, and I 100% agree, that project management is a really poorly chosen term, is there's a lot of things we do that aren't part of a project. Right? So work management is a better, more all-encompassing description. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, it's just semantics. It's not. The more you get into how you're using certain words, the more you get into the semantics of things, the more you start to understand how the words you choose really, they create a different mindset around what you're doing and how you're doing it and who you're doing it for and where you're doing it and so on and so forth. So I think it's important to adopt this new term, work management, as opposed to project management, because now we're talking about everything, even all the little one-off tasks that aren't part of a project, right? They're just one-off tasks, okay? Now, there are lots of apps that come under this heading as far as tools you can use. You're probably already using one of them, right? There's apps like ClickUp, Trello. I'm still surprised, to be honest, that some people still suggest using Trello as a work management tool. I personally think it's terrible, but there was a time when I loved it. There was a time when I thought it was great until I started accumulating too many different Trello boards, and I had no way of organizing what was where, at some top level. So I tried several times over the years, kept my $5 a month Trello subscription for the longest time, and finally dropped it because I said, okay, it's fair to say I'm never going to use this tool again. Now, all of that said, I'm also going to be the first one now to say that if you're using Trello and it's working for you, then great, don't change a thing, right? Because that's really important. A lot of us get hung up on all these tools that all these other people are using, and somehow we think because, it's like the old, well, everybody else is doing it, so maybe I need to. Stop that. Right? That's literally childish thinking. Don't assume because everybody's talking about some new tool that you need to switch to that new tool. That is the wrong reason to switch. If you've got a tool and a system and it's working for you because you're getting the information you need and you understand exactly what needs to be done and when and how to prioritize it, then don't change a thing. Use Trello if that's working for you. What I just shared with you was my experience. My experience is different from yours. You can't even compare, right? Now, some other examples real quick. ClickUp. I used to use a tool called Active Collab for a lot of years. Thought I would never, ever leave that tool. I still think it's an amazing tool. But frankly, when ClickUp came along, I just started playing with it because I wanted to see. And then little by little, I started moving processes over because the more I looked, the more I liked when it came to ClickUp. And so eventually I did switch from Active Collab over to ClickUp. And then a similar thing happened when I sort of rediscovered Notion a couple of years ago. And the same thing kind of evolved where I started little by little playing with Notion, doing more transferring processes, testing out to see how it worked in Notion. Did I like it better than ClickUp? Did I like it the same? And eventually I completely moved over from ClickUp into Notion. Now at the same time, I also told a lot of people, don't necessarily do this because I'm doing it. One of the things I love about Notion may be something you're going to hate, which is the fact that there is more than some assembly required, which is also why with my Bulletproof Notion project, I have built what I believe is the whole system you need so that it's all set up for you. In other words, I'm going to help you get past that whole assembly part. I'm going to teach you how to use everything. And then for those who care to learn, I'm going to teach you how to create the stuff from scratch. Right? So you have to choose a work management tool. And this brings up like when or why or how, as I mentioned earlier, is it time to choose a new app, right? So there's 3 criteria under which I'm going to look at and start playing with a new app to make that decision, okay? The first one is probably the most obvious. It solves a problem I don't already have solved, right? Now, within the bigger realm of work management, I'm talking about, your project, what you think of as project management. But if you start asking me questions like, well, where does QuickBooks fall into this mix? Sure, that's a work management tool. Where does your bill pay apps, if you're using some bill, like I use Routable to pay bills, if you're using something like that, sure, that's all work management. That's all the core accounting apps. What I'm talking about is the accounting adjacent area, which again is the work management. So it solves a problem I don't already have solved. The second criteria is it solves one better, which is kind of what happened, as I mentioned, when I went from Active Collab to ClickUp and then from ClickUp to Notion. In each of those 2 cases, I felt that the app I switched to solved the problem, the general problem of work management, better than the previous one had. Okay, third one. The third one is one that may only apply to me and people like me, and you may or may not be like me in this regard, which is that, it falls under the heading of a tool that it doesn't meet one of the first 2 criteria, right? It doesn't solve a problem that I don't already have solved. It doesn't solve one better necessarily. But for whatever reason, it's captured my attention as a really cool tool that I think can be useful, and that's, for now at least, just fun to play with. Perfect example of an app that recently fell into this category for me is an app called BublUp. And I did a whole webinar on how BublUp can be used by accountants, and I actually made it clear that this is not going to replace your work management tool. I don't think it ever could. I had talked with somebody at BublUp who agreed with me. If anything, it's going to be more of a supplement to whatever your primary work management tool is. Why do you need it? Because it might solve not the whole tool issue better, but it might solve a process better than what your core management tool is. Perfect example. One of the reasons I revisited BublUp and kind of dove in deep recently was Notion doesn't have a good solution for forwarding emails. It just doesn't. There's an app that, claims to be able to do it, but it does it terribly. You get this really garbled plain text version of what was at one time in that email, and it's useless to me. So in my search for the Excalibur of email forwarding for purposes of follow-up, when I want to turn an email into tasks, as it so often is the case, I needed a good tool. BublUp solves for this perfectly, and because BublUp is a really slick and robust cloud-based app, it's very easy to get my emails forwarded into BublUp and then grab a link to that, essentially the PDF of that email, and copy and paste it into Notion so that I can, track whatever task it is that I need to do around that email in my primary work management tool. So again, that process was one that Notion didn't solve for really at all, not in any way that was useful to me. So BublUp supplements what I'm doing with Notion, and together I have the perfect complement of tools and resources that I need to, once again, capture, clarify, organize, reflect, and engage with everything that I need to do. So let's talk a little bit more about how I met Notion. Now, as I mentioned, it fell under category 2. It didn't solve a problem I didn't already have solved. I just ultimately felt it solved one better. And that didn't happen right away. Like I said, I started out by using it for different processes. And the reality is what really got me to look at Notion again was I didn't have a really good note-taking tool. Now, ClickUp does have a documents feature. That's what I was using previously. And if you've ever looked at Notion and you've ever looked at ClickUp's documents feature, you'll see that ClickUp pretty much quite almost literally ripped a page out of Notion's book. Their document pages look exactly like Notion, same layout, same unsplash for the cover images. There's a lot of the ClickUp documents area that mimics Notion. But what I felt I didn't have a good handle on with ClickUp, with its documents feature, was a way to centralize all the pages and how to kind of navigate through them. For example, with ClickUp, when you create a document, you can create a document at any number of levels. I can associate the document with a task, with a list, with a space. And what was happening was I would forget where I put that document. I would know that there was a document I'd created for some such thing, maybe some meeting notes or whatever. Couldn't remember, and I couldn't find it where I expected to, right? And there is an area where you can kind of browse all your documents, but it didn't feel like there was a good, easy way to organize all that. Now, that may have changed by now, because this is already going, like I said, I got into Notion like 2 years ago, so it's been a while since I've taken another good, close look at, how ClickUp has evolved, and I know they've made a lot of changes over time. Notion... The challenge with Notion, and the reason, as I said earlier, a lot of you aren't going to love it, and I said it's because there's some assembly required, and the reason for that is that with Notion, you are quite literally starting with a blank page. So you really have to be able to conceive of what you want to create and how you want to create it. Now, there's no question in my mind that of all the tools out there for taking notes, nothing's better than Notion. So even if I had only used Notion for the note-taking portion, for meeting notes and other things that I wanted to sort of document my thoughts and so on, I would have kept Notion and maybe stayed in ClickUp for everything else and just linked Notion pages within tasks or whatever I'm looking for, or whatever it's associated with in ClickUp, right? But ultimately, as I learned more about how to use Notion, I learned how to use databases. I learned how to use Notion to build out a whole system for tracking everything that I needed to do. And ultimately it evolved into a system that I can definitely trust. I don't have the stress of getting those random reminders in my brain because I know that I have a system that I'm looking at regularly and that I'm constantly going through it every day and organizing, okay, what did I get done? I can mark those things done. What do I still need to do? I can push those into tomorrow, and I've got that next action item list that I use heavily to determine when and whether or not it's time to take something off that list and go schedule it, or if I have some free time, let me knock one out, right? So, bottom line, Notion started out as a sort of not a category 1 or 2 unless you really kind of drill that down into the processes. Like I said, so initially it was the process of taking notes that I adopted it for. And then little by little, I pulled other processes over. Like I said, I tested it. I set up one client in it to see, how's this going to work? Can I do this? Can I make it work? And little by little, not only did I like it, I just liked it a lot better. So I made the choice to move it all over to Notion, right? Now, the thing I like about this, by contrast with ClickUp or Asana or any of these other tools that are built sort of out of the box for project management, is that fact alone, even though they may be very good tools, and no question there are. I mean, there's no shortage of people who use them, and clearly they can attest to the fact that it works for them. But what made me love Notion even better, and again, this may not be a criteria for you, but for me it definitely was the idea that if I can conceive it, I can create it. In other words, Notion gives me a blank page, which means it gives me a platform where I can conceive of exactly how I want my workflows to look like, to be structured, and I can build that out. Now, the reality is, on the surface, and if you don't have a lot of experience with Notion, it's going to look linear. It's going to look like pages and subpages. But the alternate reality is, the more you learn about how to use Notion, the more I've been teaching people to hide that sidebar, which is what's going to kind of lead you to think of Notion that way, and start learning how to use the robust linking capabilities and all kinds of other things, the way you can tag, a page from anywhere, tag a person, a collaborator, to or from anywhere, the way Notion creates backlinks. So if I link to one page, the destination page automatically creates a backlink to the source. When you start understanding how Notion kind of builds the experience for you as you go, as you begin to build things and structure your layouts, the more you realize it is anything but linear. It is completely geometric. In fact, it's sort of like the perfect neural network, which much better mimics the way our brains work. Most apps that we use are designed in a very linear structure, right? Thinking of ClickUp, I have spaces, then I have folders, then I have lists, then tasks, then subtasks. It's linear. It's, with a substructure, right? But the way our brains work is our brains are a neural network. And when you start organizing information more consistent with the way your brains work, it's like magic. At first, I think it can be overwhelming for people, but once you start getting used to it, it's like magic, because I think our brains are actually inherently wired to work better this way, but we're so used to working in linear spaces that it takes a minute to kind of adjust to a new way of thinking. But like I said, that new way of thinking is much closer to the way our brains are actually designed and wired to work. So why am I doing this whole campaign on improving productivity with the specific goal in mind of reducing stress? Well, let's go back to David Allen's book, and I love the way he explains the notion of, no pun intended, of a mind like water. Now, if you've done any meditating, and you should, it's actually part of the process here that I'm going to talk about in my bigger picture Bulletproof Notion project, then you'll understand this reference. But when you think about it, and going back to the fact that, and I'm especially speaking, of course, to accountants and bookkeepers, going back to the fact that a lot of us are so stressed out because we have so much stuff that we need to track and manage, and it's like we're up to our eyeballs, frankly, and we don't know how we're going to ever get on top of everything. And that creates a lot of stress. So the goal here is to reduce, if not eliminate, stress. Some of you are going to hear me say eliminate stress and think, yeah, that's not realistic. But I think it is. I think it is actually very realistic, because, again, when you are able to perfect a system you can trust, and as I mentioned, a little while ago, when you're more realistic about it, and by under-scheduling instead of over-scheduling, because then you get a clearer picture of what really needs to be managed and in what time frame, and so you start getting much better at setting expectations with clients. For example, hey, no, I can't get that to you, by then I have too much on my plate, and or you want me to get that done, you want me to put you ahead of the line, we got to talk about a rush charge. Things like that are what start to come into play when you are much more realistic about your own timeline and time frame in terms of what you can realistically or reasonably be expected to get things done. Or you hire people to help you, accomplish more in less time. So a mind like water. Because here's what happens when we're stressed out. When I'm really stressed out and, I'm having one of those days where things are just keep getting thrown at me, and all it takes is for like one client to come at me with some kind of frustration and accusation for me to just kind of lose it, right? And all of a sudden, that one poor client is going to suffer the wrath of like years and years of buildup of stress where I'm going to go off on them, only to realize that that person didn't deserve it. My reaction, in other words, was completely disproportionate to what they might have been asking of me. And then I'm going to have to go apologize, right? If I don't lose the client, which I might end up viewing as a good thing, but it's the wrong way, of course, to lose the client. So a mind like water, David Allen describes this beautifully. You drop a rock into a calm body of water, and what happens? You can visualize it already. You can see that ripple effect, right? You can probably picture it right now in your mind. The water has a reaction that's in perfect proportion to the stimulus. The rock drops in, it creates the ripples, and then within a minute or two, those ripples go away, and the water returns to calm. That's what a mind like water is. We want our minds to work the same way, so that if a client comes in on a day when I'm, more stressed than usual with something that's adding to my stress, I start to recognize that client doesn't understand what I'm going through. They don't understand the battles I'm fighting. They just understand from their end that they're stressed out. They're expecting something to get done, and for whatever reason, they don't feel I'm meeting that expectation. That's usually, in the most generic terms, what leads to a client's frustration. And so I can respond to that, with the right sort of proportion of response to that stimulus, and explain calmly to the client that I'll do everything I can, and then be honest and upfront and set a realistic expectation, right? That's what it looks like when I'm working in an environment where I can work with a mind like water. And the more I can work towards that, the less stressed out I'm going to be. And the less stressed out I am, the less likely I'm ever going to have a reaction like the one I described to a client who's simply trying to understand exactly what their expectations should be. And for that matter, if they don't feel that expectation is being met, why? And I can kind of reset that expectation with them, right? So that's what a mind like water is all about. The next thing, and this brings up another source that I'm studying, which is called The Art of Finding Flow. Or is it The Art of Getting into Flow? I always forget. I always mix up the title a little bit. I'll get it right in the notes to make sure that you can access the book. Actually had an email conversation with the author, super nice guy, and it's a great book. So this is another thing that underlying all of this obsession with productivity is it's like the Holy Grail, right? I talked about Excalibur. This is the Holy Grail of all of this productivity and mind like water and reducing stress. What it really boils down to is I want to be able to intentionally induce a flow state. Now, what's a flow state? You've all experienced it, I'm sure, at one time or another. And here are the basic criteria, as I'm learning from Damon's book, for how you get into a flow state, what usually causes it. So usually it's I'm about to engage in work that's challenging. In other words, it's not like doing bank recs where I can do it in my sleep and it's frankly boring to me at this point. It's got to be challenging work that forces me to have to think and, maybe develop new learning, new understandings of things. In other words, I have to figure out how to do something I didn't already know how to do. So there's the criteria is there's a range here where it's challenging but not impossible, right? If it's impossible to do, if it's just beyond my comprehension, I'm going to get stressed out. Never get into a flow state when I'm stressed out. What happens is, as you've probably experienced, when you get a flow state, is everything that's going on around you kind of fades to the background, and you get really, really focused. And time usually does one or two things in these experiences. It either speeds up or slows down. Neither one is better than the other. It's just what it is. Oftentimes you'll find you come out of that flow state like 3 hours later. It feels like only 5 minutes went by, but you've just accomplished something tremendous. And there's this incredibly good feeling you get coming out of that flow state when you realize what you've just done. So, but usually, the feeling, the appearance is that, we just get lucky when this happens. So Damon's book is about how it's not so much about luck, or it doesn't need to be. We don't need to wait to get lucky. We can actually learn to develop some processes and set up our environment to increase our likelihood of getting into a flow state. Now, why is this flow state so important? Well, as I described, everything else fades to the background. Your mind is quiet. It's the ultimate form of a mind like water. It is where most of us are truly at our happiest in those moments because there's literally nothing going on in our minds. We're just instinctively working and, getting something done that we are really focused on. And I'm avoiding using the term hyper-focus because, as Damon points out, that's something different, which isn't necessarily a good thing. We don't want to get hyper-focused. That's usually where I'm like kind of stressed out and ignoring everyone around me. The flow state is with much less effort. It's my mind is free. right? It's truly free at that point. I'm not thinking about anything. I'm just doing. So let's wrap up on work management apps. Quick recap. So work management apps, we're talking about what you normally think of as project management apps. Whatever app you're using, if it's working for you, great. I think the question really is, if you're finding that you're stressed out and overwhelmed and you don't feel like you can ever get on top of everything, don't blame the tool necessarily. If anything, if you're using one of these popular tools, it's probably not the tool. It's probably more your system for how you're using the tool. So bottom line, look at your tech stack. We have the three major areas: communications, planning, and what we're going to talk about next, which is resources. Right now we're in the planning area, and we're talking about your work management tool. And as I said, your accounting core apps like QuickBooks Online and all the apps you use to process accounting, those all come under that heading. But we're not concerned about those, at least not for today's purpose. Today's purpose is to really look at the bigger picture work management app, meaning the app you use to manage all of the work that you have to do, all the stuff you're going to be doing for your clients in QuickBooks or QuickBooks Online. So pick something. If you don't have something chosen, pick it based on the three criteria I mentioned. Again, it solves a problem you don't already have solved. It solves one better, or at least for now, it looks like a fun toy to play with. Doesn't solve any problems or solve any better, but it looks like something that might be really useful. And like I said, like if you start playing with BublUp, you'll see it's such a cool visual app that if your experience is anything like mine, you're going to find yourself wanting to find things to use it for. As long as it's not taking away. And again, if you're somebody who's going to be easily distracted or overwhelmed, then don't go there. Don't go there until you feel like you're really on top of things. Then there might be room for a quote-unquote toy to play with, right? So now I want to talk about, first of all, once you've chosen those apps and you've decided what you're going to do, and like I said, it may not be the tool if you're really stressed out. It may be the sort of lack of a system for how you're using it, which means you need an SOP or a standard operating procedure for every app you use and how you use it. And we're talking about work management. There may be many layers to that in terms of, just kind of the rules of engagement. For example, in my organization, anytime you create a task, there has to be a due date and there has to be an assigned to. Hard and fast rule. If I see that somebody's created a task and it doesn't have both of those things, I'm going to ping them and say, hey, you need to fix this, right? And these are things that, as Nick Sonnenberg explains in Come Up for Air, most of us are kind of, because we're so stressed out and we don't feel like we have the time to slow down and think about things, too thoroughly, we're going to tend to optimize things for transmission when what we really need to be doing is optimize for retrieval. The difference meaning that I can fire off an email to somebody and put some notes in that email and shoot it off, but good luck finding that in a month or two from now, right? Whereas what's optimized for retrieval is where I might, using the example of Notion, I might write up those notes on a page in Notion that's organized, right? Remember, capture, clarify, and organize. It's organized in a place where I know where to go to find it if I need it. So then I can shoot off the email to the client with the link to that page and say, hey, here's my notes on blah, blah, blah. And then if the client, as they almost inevitably will, reaches out to me in a month and says, hey, I can't find that link you sent me, great, in 2 seconds I can grab that link and send it again. And for that matter, if I have a well-organized wiki, right, which is where my SOPs are going to live, then anybody else in my organization can probably pretty quickly figure out where that page is and shoot the link off in case I'm not around. Meaning, optimize for retrieval means I or anyone else in my organization can quickly find that thing and share it with whoever it needs to be shared with, okay? And that brings us into the third and final category of apps, which are your resources. And now, as I mentioned, we're going to have two things in here. We're going to have the company wiki, and then what the SOPs really go into is what we call process management. Right? Now, Notion is, the company wiki is the one area that Nick Sonnenberg suggests you can definitely and should definitely use Notion for, although I think I remember that they were saying they actually like Coda better. It's a competing app to Notion. I tried Coda and I hated it. I could not get my head wrapped around it. It seems like it's a lot like Notion, but maybe I just didn't really spend enough time with it, but I found it very clunky and difficult to figure out how to kind of get a flow going with it where I could get things set up and organized. So I tried it for about a month, basically on their recommendation, and I ran right back to Notion very quickly. So the company wiki you can set up in Notion for sure. Now the process management, these guys, Nick Sonnenberg's team are going to recommend things like Process Street or Suite Process are the two probably most popular process management applications. This is where I believe Notion lends itself perfectly to building out your SOPs, which is your process management. Now, I want to clear something up right away where I've already noticed in a short time that there tends to be a lot of confusion here. Because we'll write up an SOP, which again is your standard operating procedure, which is really just a list. It can be bullet points or check boxes, some format, but a list of exactly the steps that one needs to take to complete a process, right? Think about something like bank reconciliation, right? The first step, get the bank statements, right? Actually, before that, answer the question, has the month closed, right? Has the statement period closed? Because it may not be a calendar month, especially with credit cards. So that's and so then you list the steps. Okay, the month has closed. Great, let's go to the next step. Get the statements. In my organization, it's going to be, I need both the PDF and the CSV form. I need that saved into our file management system, which happens to be Google Drive, which is another SOP, but this is where I'm writing up the SOP for how to do bank recs, and I'm going to sort of link to or mention in Notion, the other SOP that you may need to reference because we have rules around how we keep our files organized in Google Drive, which is where the statements are going to go, right? Or I even have a process and a template in Notion for those who prefer it, where you can actually document all those statements in Notion itself, right? So lots of ways you can go. There's lots of flexibility. Bottom line, you have to decide what your process is and document that. Now here's where the confusion comes up is people see the SOP and they think, oh, when I'm actually doing the work, I'm going to take this out and start checking things off. No. The SOP or your process management area, which I believe should just be an area within your wiki, it's a reference library. It's what you refer to. Then in your work management area, you can build templates that kind of, you basically peel those steps from your SOP off into a template in the work management area. So when you're actually doing the work, you're in your work management area. Then if you decide, and again, we need a process for this, which also goes into the process management part. If while you're doing bank recs, you realize that something new has come up that's not accounted for in the SOP, then you need to go back and update that SOP. But it shouldn't just be willy-nilly, hey, I'm going to add this new thing. There should be a process. There's usually one person who owns the process management area, so that if you have a suggestion for an update, it goes through that person. It should be that way to keep it all manageable so that people aren't making a mess of things in the SOP. This helps keep it organized. So there should be a person in your organization. Maybe it's you as the owner if it's a smaller organization. If not, somebody you trust to keep things organized. But that person is designated to have all updates to SOPs, go through. And so that's the process management area, and you should have an SOP for every little different process that you do. The more you can document, the better. The idea is if I hire somebody, if I need to take off for a month, to put it kind of in an extreme illustration, if I need to take off for a month, I should be able to bring somebody in cold off the street and put them in front of my company wiki, show them where the SOPs are, and say, these are all the things I need you to work on for me while I'm away. And they practically wouldn't even need any instruction from me because it's all really well documented in the process management area of my company wiki. And one other thing I'll mention on this, a lot of companies are bought not for their customers, not for their sales, but for their processes. So if you have even the most remote thought of one day selling your company, the better you have your process management area, your SOPs written up, the more organized it is, the easier it is to find things for somebody who doesn't know anything about what's in there. The greater the value of your organization, and very likely the more you can sell your company for if and when the time comes. Right? So now the company, I kind of skipped ahead to process management. I didn't really talk that much about the company wiki, but the company wiki is, like I said, it's going to likely include your process management area unless you choose one of those other apps, right? So in that case, you would have something in Notion in your company wiki that says something like, for process management, see Suite Process, right? And you have a link to Suite Process where people can go log into that. So either way, what the wiki does is the wiki organizes resources that any employee might need to access. And I love Nick's example and explanation of this. So I get a new employee that I hire, and that person is going to be looking for the employee manual because they're probably told at some point you have to download the employee manual, read it, and sign it, confirming that you understand and agree to what's in there. Now that employee, if they're not told otherwise, is probably going to ask the person sitting next to them, or they're going to go into Slack if we're all remote and ping one of the other employees and say, hey, how do I get the employee manual? Now, if your organization has a well-organized wiki, all that person on the receiving end of that request needs to be able to do is say, here's a link to the company wiki. It's very easy to find. Just follow the navigation. You'll see where the HR area is, and within that, where the HR manual is. You can download it, print it or digitally sign it, and then, and the instructions are all there for everything you need to do. And then in the company wiki, you have that area organized, well laid out, so nobody has to explain to them how to navigate to it. It should be very self-explanatory. And it should also be self-explanatory how they download the document, and then that they can DocuSign it or whatever they're going to use to sign it. And now it doesn't go back into the company wiki because that's really just reference information. Now it has to go into somebody's work management area, whoever's responsible for keeping that stuff on file, right? So that's going to go to your HR person's work management area, wherever you store all of the signed HR manuals. Now that's just one example. There's lots of other things you could put in a company wiki. And as I release my Bulletproof Notion project near the end of this year, I'll have a lot more detailed documentation on really how to build a wiki and what should be in there and even what things shouldn't be in there, because there can be a little bit of confusion in terms of some overlap. So, and there's no shortage of resources, by the way, online, in terms of, how to build a company wiki. And keep in mind, it's going to be different depending on the size of your organization. And also, as I mentioned, if you're remote, there are certain things that you would probably have in a company wiki where people are working in a physical location that you wouldn't have. A common example is, like places to go eat, menus or whatever, links to. So even things like that, when you're thinking resources in a wiki, you want to think broad. You want to think everything that would make all of your employees' lives really easy and make it, frankly, more enjoyable to work there, because you've given them a really cool tool that they have access to right at their fingertips that helps them empower themselves to find anything they could possibly need, from what to do for lunch to how to find the SOPs to make sure they're performing whatever work they're hired to do very effectively, very accurately, and of course, very efficiently. So that's basically the resources area. Again, it's divided up into two: the company wiki and the process management part, which is where all of your SOPs live. So that, my friends, is your tech stack status update for this time, going into almost the last quarter of 2023. And you might have been expecting me to give you more specific direction on different apps and how to choose them. But if you really paid attention, and you may want to go back and review this and take notes if you weren't doing so already, what I really wanted to give you here was a framework for how to empower your own decisions about this, how to decide maybe what we have is working really well, but maybe we need to tighten up the systems in terms of how we're using it. Or maybe you like the idea of using Notion instead of whatever tool you might be using. Or maybe there's some other tool out there. Just because I love something doesn't mean you can or will or should, right? Everybody's got to kind of figure that out for yourselves. And more importantly, if you have an organization that's bigger than you, you really have to think group level, what's going to work best for us. Nick's book is really written towards companies that are trying to optimize for retrieval at the group level, at a large group. That's a different dynamic than if it's just you or maybe you and one or two or three other people. So there are a lot of things to consider here, but most importantly, I wanted to give you this framework that I've been learning about from Come Up for Air, and also the framework that many of you have known about for years from David Allen's Getting Things Done, but I feel like a lot of us have forgotten it. I haven't heard people talking about it much because it's been years since he wrote the book. Years ago, I remember there was all this buzz about it, and I think you can still get certified in the GTD method. But more importantly for me, I want you to understand those concepts and how to take them and apply them in whatever app you're going to use, because that's the key. That's how you're going to be able to move towards having a mind like water, because that's how you're going to be able to capture, clarify, and organize everything in a system you can trust. And the reason you're going to trust it is because you have a process for reflecting on everything that's in there. And ultimately, of course, you're engaging with what's in there to actually get the work done. That's it, my friends. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. If you're watching this on YouTube or wherever else you're watching, just look for links to the appropriate resources. And I'm not hard to find, and I look forward to getting your comments, questions, takeaways, and, of course, feedback on anything that you've heard and learned here.